So here I am with my very first author spotlight for this vlog. I am coming at you slightly frustrated because I've already recorded this all once with my new camera setup, with my new mic, so I can work in a variety of places like the yard without having to yell. I tested it, I brought it out, I started, I didn't test it again because it was working great, and yeah, I recorded with no sound the entire thing. So I had this great little setup the first time around. Well, now I've got you on a bucket and I'm just sitting on the grass because I'm not going through all of that again. So for my June author spotlight, I am going to cover my very, very, very favorite, long-term favorite, Dean Koontz. You may know him, you may love him, you may hate him. I absolutely adore him. I think it's fantastic that he's been writing. I think he's in his 7th decade now of writing. He was born in 1940 something. He published his first book, Star Quest, back in 1968. His original genre was like sci-fi, and over that first decade of publishing, he evolved into the mystery, thriller, suspense that we know and love now. The very first book I read by Dean was Night Chills, and I read it back when I was 13 or 14. I had gotten a copy from somewhere, I think maybe at a summer camp or something, and I just fell in love, and I moved on from what was the young adult version at that time into an avid Dean Koontz reader, and I read probably everything I could get my hands on that he'd written in that genre up to the point when I started reading, and then I began collecting every single book as they came out. I used to have a huge collection. When I moved, I just didn't have room, so I'd pared it down some. My son had some of them, and then he pared it down further, so I don't actually have any hard copies of any of his books anymore. Everything is on my Kindle, and I slowly reread them and accumulate more as I go. So but he is very much not sci-fi, but fantasy, thriller, horror, mystery. He covers such a range of genres that I don't really even know where I would term it as one set genre. So I'm going to cover some of what I like, some of what I haven't read, newest release, some personal stuff about him, and why I now relate to him as an adult. So over the course of 11 years, Dean wrote this great series. He started it in 2003. It was finished up in, I believe, 2014. There were 8 books total, plus a little novella mixed in. There were graphic comics mixed in. I don't really do the graphic comics. I just stuck with the books, and of course I read the novella. But if you don't know, I am talking about Odd Thomas. We are introduced to Odd in book 1, which is simply Odd Thomas, as my name is Odd. And we learn that Odd is writing his memoirs as commissioned by his friend Ozzie Boone. And we follow Odd along as he narrates his memoirs throughout this series of stories. Odd becomes one of the most well-rounded characters I've ever read from anybody. You learn Odd inside and out. You learn his past. You learn where he's at now. You get glimpses of how he sees his future throughout. Just great read overall. It's got everything. It's got a little bit of romance when it comes to his girlfriend Stormy. It's got mystery, suspense, murder, very fast-paced action, some slower, sweeter moments. You'll hear Odd say the dead don't talk. I don't know why, because Odd has ghosts that travel his journey with him, but they never speak to him. They just kind of walk with him, and they are brought in a humorous way, for the most part. And some of the ones that popped up throughout the series kind of made me chuckle. And the way Odd describes them as they're walking alongside him. But Odd goes through all kinds of events, all kinds of places. In one of the books, Brother Odd, he goes to a monastery and has a stay there. There's this evil entity that appears as a running theme throughout the books as things are going to happen. So when Odd sees these entities, you know the story is going to ramp up. And he knows that something bad is coming. But I absolutely adore these books. I do own them on my Kindle, so I do reread them on a fairly regular basis. They're one of the few series that I quite regularly reread, because I am not typically much of a rereader. So if you have not ever been introduced to Odd, and if you want to laugh and cry and go through the whole range of emotions and the whole range of every genre you can think of, I would definitely check out these books. My very, very, very favorite series of all time. So in other series, because Dean has a couple of other series, he's not a serial writer. The bulk of his work is standalones, but he does have a couple of series, obviously. So I have not yet read the Jane Hawk series. Somehow I had a period where I was just strictly reading Kindle Unlimited, and he wasn't available on Kindle Unlimited at all at that point. So these kind of flew under my radar, but the Jane Hawk series, I do have them downloaded to my phone now. I just haven't gotten a chance to read through them yet. So they are on my reading list for June. So I should be able to recap those at the end of the month in my monthly wrap-up. But Dean also wrote a series, Frankenstein, which I'm going to be honest, I have not read. I don't really have an interest in reading. I don't even know that I remember what the description was that just made it not up my alley. I don't know if it went too far back to like the old Frankenstein monster, or just something about it at the time when he started them just didn't interest me, so I've never touched on them. Maybe someday, if I have nothing else in my queue, I'll grab one of them and give it a try, just to be able to round out my Dean reading from, 1976 on. Because that was the year Night Chills was published, so that was my first. I go back to reading him that far. So Frankenstein, it's out there. I haven't read them. Maybe I will. He wrote a trilogy called the Moonlight Bay Trilogy. Sorry, I have to double check here because I don't want to mess up. He wrote the first one in 1998, and that one was Fear Nothing. The second one was Seize the Night. The third one, which, yes, it's an unfinished trilogy. The third one, Ride the Storm, has never been finished. Supposedly he's worked on it. He always says when asked in an interview that he's going to finish them, but he just never has. So, but the Moonlight Bay Trilogy is about Christopher Snow, who has I don't know the technical term, but he can't go out during the day. He's got a problem, a medical problem, and I wish I could remember what he called it, but I believe it's some kind of pigmentation problem, not albinism, but anyways. But we follow Christopher Snow through this trilogy, and we end up ultimately not ever knowing what happened with Christopher because it's unfinished. So hopefully someday it'll get finished so we can have closure on that. I believe he hasn't finished it in part because the publishers of the original books own the rights to the book and he's no longer with them. I think I heard rumor of at some point. And he's often said he's going to do a complete rewrite and make one epic novel of them all. So I would love to see that happen because it was a series that I really started to enjoy, and it just kind of ended up dead in the water. But so if you want to read an unfinished trilogy, definitely check out the Moonlight Bay ones. But they're probably like my second favorite books by Dean, so check them out. Dean's newest release from March of 2021 is, to me, more representative of his 90s works, maybe, than some of his other recent releases. It was like full on suspenseful, action-packed, page-turning. Like, there was never a point where you wanted to put that book down and go to sleep. You wanted to get to the end, and you wanted to know what happened. And it was an awesome, awesome read. I'll put the book cover up over here so you can see The Other Emily. But in short, in The Other Emily, we follow David Thorne, who is an author, through his journey of figuring out what happened to his girlfriend, Emily Carlino, who had disappeared 10 years ago. She was driving by herself on a dark and stormy night and disappeared. They chalked it up to a serial killer at the time, Ronnie Jessup, who David has gone to see in jail many, many times, trying to get answers because he feels very, very guilty about the night that Emily disappeared. But he repeatedly goes and asks Ronnie where Emily's body is and what happened with Emily, and Ronnie never gives him answers. He may give him answers about other stuff that lead David on this other tangent to go look for more information, but he does get clues and hints throughout, and he uses his resources as an author to get help, and he stumbles on this girl called Madison Sutton, who is the epitome of Emily. He feels like it's Emily come back, except it's Emily still 10 years ago. Madison is the very, very image of Emily, except for certain things. So, and Madison kind of weasels her way into his life, and he falls for Madison and goes through this emotional wild ride in the middle of trying to figure out what happened with Emily, and he's falling in love with Madison, and I don't want to ruin how any of this ends, so, but his whole mission throughout the book is trying to get information from Ronnie on where Emily is, trying to figure out who Madison is, where she came from, because she's not very forthcoming with any kind of information. She's just kind of appears there. So we follow David's journey throughout the book, and Dean, as always, feeds us clues all the way through, and some of them you'll pick up on, some of them you won't even realize were a clue that he was spoon-feeding you. It's just, to me, it was edge of your seat. Like, you had to get to the end because you had to know how this was all going to wrap up. And, you know, there are times when you're yelling at David not to go do something, or you're yelling at him to go do something because you think you know what's going on. And it was just, this is why he is like the master of suspense and thriller. And the end was very satisfying once you got there and you got it all wrapped up in your head. But definitely, I highly recommend that you check this one out. To me, it's more classic Dean style than some of the other more recent works I've read. Not that there's anything wrong with those, but to me, this was like reading old school Dean Koontz. Very suspenseful, very masterful, very full character development, wild ride. And I definitely did lose some sleep because I did read this in like a day. I mean, I devoted my life that day to reading this book. So, The Other Emily, check it out. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about dogs. Dean Koontz writes dogs into darn near every book he's ever written. It's always been a running theme. They may just pop up once or twice. They may become a fully developed main character. Dean especially writes about golden retrievers. Dean and his wife Gerda had a golden retriever named Trixie, who was the light of their life. She was like their child. They always thought she was very special and very smart. She was on the dust jackets with him. There was always a little blurb in the cover about her. Dean wrote books from her perspective. Dean wrote a book about her after her passing. I will admit, when I learned that Trixie died, I shed a few tears for Dean and his wife. But Dean wrote A Big Little Life, a memoir of a joyful dog, which is funny, heartwarming, joyful. That was about Trixie's life. If you want a light, fun read, stories told of a dog's life, read this one. It's quite old at this point, but I very much enjoyed reading about Trixie. I didn't personally have a golden retriever at the time, but I fell in love with the breed through Dean's reading and seeing how smart and everything he thought they were. He does a great job accurately describing their personalities, and they definitely do live a big little life. I'm going to put a picture of my reading partner up here. This is my golden Blake. He is 10 now, so he is getting up there, but he's my good boy. So I now fully understand Dean's love of Goldens. Dean didn't write about Goldens because everybody loved Goldens and people were going to want to read his books because he wrote about Goldens. I mean, some authors today, because Goldens are written so much about, will actually avoid the breed just because they don't want it to be, they're writing about it because it's trendy. Dean was never because it's trendy. It's because he had experience and thought they were super smart and wonderful dogs. So he has written Goldens as, I believe, 3 like main characters in his books throughout time, and they are all really good reads. I did read all of these years ago as they came out. He has Einstein, who is one of the main running characters in the book Watchers. He has Kip, who runs throughout the book Devoted, and then he has Nikki, who is featured in The Darkest Evening of the Year. So if you want to read some of his books where he more features the Goldens and writes them into the main meat of the story, definitely check those 3 out. They are all good books. I'm not going to review them all now, but it's definitely a thing with Dean. The Goldens popping up here and there. I mean, there are other dogs that pop up here and there, and there's a dog in almost every work, but Goldens have a special place in his heart, and now having my own, I fully understand that. So all in all, I don't know how many books I've read by Dean. I would probably put it in the 60 to 70 mark, maybe more. I haven't sat down with a list recently and gone through to like mark them all off, but I do know I had something like 55 books when I pared down my bookshelf. So, and that was 10 years ago. So everything new since then has been added, and things that I didn't have that would have come from the library or, you know, some other outlet, borrowed, whatever. So definitely my favorite of all time. Probably my most read, if not close to most read. I have a couple of other authors that have a really long-running series, so they may come close, but definitely my all-time favorite. If you are mystery, horror, suspense, and you haven't been reading Dean, or you've just never been introduced to him, I would highly, highly recommend you do. Obviously, if you go back to his older works, it's kind of funny because there's no modern technology. But my very, very favorite, and I thought he was worthy of my first author spotlight just because he's always had a special place in my heart. So that's it. I'm going to wrap this up, and let me know if you're a Dean reader and what your favorite book was.